Before we begin, allow your attention to slowly step away from the present moment. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to go. The world of schedules and screens can remain where it is while we move gently backward in time, far beyond recorded history, beyond writing, beyond cities. There was a long stretch of human experience that left only quiet traces in the earth. Tonight, we are visiting one of those traces, not as tourists and not as seekers of revelation, but as careful observers. This is a place uncovered gradually, piece by piece, by patient excavation and cautious interpretation. It is a place that does not shout answers, but instead asks steady, unsettling questions. At roughly 10,000 years before the present, when the last ice age was drawing to a close, groups of hunter-gatherers gathered on a hill in what is now southeastern Turkey. They shaped stone with intention and effort. They arranged space in ways that still resist easy explanation. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe and why its existence quietly reshapes how we think about the beginnings of civilization. What history traditionally expects from the deep past is a simple progression. First, small bands of hunter-gatherers moving through familiar landscapes. Then, much later, agriculture. Only after farming, we are taught, do permanent settlements appear. And only after settlements do monuments, organized labor, and large-scale symbolic architecture become possible. Göbekli Tepe does not follow this sequence. Dating to approximately 10,000 years before the present, it stands far earlier than the rise of farming societies in the region. According to radiocarbon evidence, it belongs to a time when humans are believed to have lived without domesticated plants or animals. Yet here, embedded in a limestone hill, are massive stone enclosures that suggest planning, coordination, and shared purpose on a scale previously thought impossible for that era. If you would like to quietly return to explorations like this in the future, you may choose to subscribe. There is no urgency in that choice. It simply allows these conversations with the distant past to continue, slowly and thoughtfully, whenever you are ready. The site itself is not visually dramatic in the modern sense. There are no towering walls or expansive city grids. Instead, what emerges are circular and oval enclosures defined by upright stone pillars. These pillars are carefully shaped into a distinctive T-form, some reaching heights of more than 15 feet. Their surfaces are smoothed, their edges controlled. They were not placed randomly. Each one stands in deliberate relation to the others. Archaeologists working at Göbekli Tepe have noted that the central pillars in each enclosure are often larger than the rest, positioned facing one another. This arrangement suggests an internal logic, a design that was repeated with variation across multiple structures. The repetition itself implies shared knowledge, perhaps even shared tradition, passed between groups or generations. What makes this especially striking is the absence of evidence for everyday domestic life. There are no hearths clearly associated with long-term habitation. There is little indication of permanent dwellings. Instead, the site appears to have been visited, used, and returned to over centuries. One possible interpretation is that Göbekli Tepe was not a village, but a place set apart. The stone surfaces are decorated with carved reliefs. Animals appear frequently: foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and insects. These figures are not simply decorative. They are rendered with care and consistency, sometimes repeated across different enclosures. Abstract symbols also appear, their meanings uncertain. It remains unclear whether these carvings represent myth, clan identity, seasonal ritual, or something else entirely. What can be said with confidence is that carving stone at this scale requires time, skill, and coordination. Someone had to quarry the limestone. Someone had to shape it with stone tools. Someone had to transport and raise pillars weighing many tons. This raises the question of how such labor was organized without agriculture, without surplus food stores, and without permanent leadership structures that we can clearly identify. Some archaeologists suggest that ritual itself may have been the organizing force, that shared belief or shared memory brought people together repeatedly, long before fields were planted or cities imagined. If that is the case, Göbekli Tepe may represent not a result of civilization, but one of its earliest preconditions. As we move forward, it becomes necessary to look more closely at what is actually known about this site, how it was excavated, and what the material evidence allows us to say with care and restraint. The question left at the end of our last reflection lingers quietly. What exactly do we know about this place, beyond its ability to unsettle our expectations? To move forward honestly, we need to slow down and ground ourselves in the archaeological context of Göbekli Tepe, setting aside interpretation for a moment and focusing on what has been carefully documented. Göbekli Tepe is located in southeastern Anatolia, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa. The site sits atop a limestone ridge, offering a wide view of the surrounding landscape. This elevated position appears to have been chosen intentionally. It is not a place of concealment, but one of visibility. Anyone approaching would have been seen from a distance, and anyone standing there would have been acutely aware of the horizon. The site was first identified in the 1960s, but for decades it was misinterpreted as a medieval cemetery. Only in the 1990s did systematic excavation begin, revealing that the visible stones were not grave markers, but the tops of much older, much larger structures buried beneath accumulated soil. What has been uncovered so far represents only a small portion of the total site. Geophysical surveys suggest that many more enclosures remain unexcavated, still sealed below the surface. Radiocarbon dating of organic material associated with the structures places the earliest phases of construction around 10,000 BC during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. This dating is not based on a single sample, but on multiple measurements taken over time. While precise years are always subject to refinement, the broad time frame is widely accepted among researchers. The architecture itself follows a consistent pattern. Circular or oval enclosures are formed by stone walls, inside which stand multiple T-shaped pillars. At the center of each enclosure are two larger pillars, often aligned along a shared axis. The pillars are carved from local limestone, quarried nearby. Tool marks suggest the use of flint implements rather than metal, which aligns with the technological capabilities of the period. Importantly, the T-shaped pillars are not abstract slabs. Many are carved in low relief with animals and symbols. Some pillars show arms carved along their sides, with hands meeting at the front, suggesting that the pillars themselves may represent stylized human figures. This interpretation is not universally accepted, but it is grounded in observable features rather than speculation. If the pillars are indeed anthropomorphic, they would represent some of the earliest large-scale human representations known. Animal imagery dominates the iconography. Predatory and dangerous creatures appear frequently. There is little emphasis on domesticated animals, which is consistent with the absence of agriculture at the time. Some archaeologists suggest that these animals may have held symbolic significance tied to identity, storytelling, or ritual practice. Others caution that meaning cannot be confidently assigned without written records. Both positions reflect the careful balance required when interpreting prehistoric art. One of the most striking aspects of Göbekli Tepe is how it was abandoned. The enclosures were not destroyed by natural disaster. Instead, they appear to have been intentionally filled in with rubble, stone fragments, and soil. This backfilling preserved the structures remarkably well, sealing them beneath the landscape. The reasons for this deliberate burial remain unclear. It may have marked the end of a ritual cycle, a shift in social organization, or a changing relationship to the site itself. What is notably absent from the archaeological record is evidence of long-term domestic life. There are no clear houses, no storage facilities associated with farming, and no definitive signs of sustained habitation. Instead, the material remains suggest periodic gatherings. Feasting may have occurred, as indicated by animal bones found on site, but even this interpretation remains cautious. As the last ice age was ending, the climate of the region was changing. Resources were becoming more predictable. Wild grains were increasingly abundant. This environmental context forms a quiet backdrop to Göbekli Tepe's construction. It does not explain the site on its own, but it reminds us that human societies were already adapting to new conditions. With this archaeological foundation in place, we can now turn more directly to the central problem Göbekli Tepe presents. Not simply what it is, but why it exists at all, and why it appears at this particular moment in human history. That final question carries us forward almost naturally. Once the physical facts are laid out, once the dating, location, and material evidence are acknowledged, the deeper tension begins to surface. Göbekli Tepe is not puzzling because it is old. It is puzzling because of when it appears and what it seems to require from the people who built it. For much of the 20th century, archaeological models assumed a largely linear progression. Environmental stability leads to agriculture. Agriculture produces surplus. Surplus allows specialization. Specialization enables hierarchy, large projects, and symbolic architecture. In this framework, monuments are the outcome of settled life. They are built by societies that already farm, store food, and manage labor over long periods. Göbekli Tepe interrupts that sequence. Here, we see monumental construction before clear evidence of farming. The scale of the stone pillars alone demands careful consideration. Some weigh several tons. Quarrying them required planning. Transporting them required coordination. Erecting them required shared effort and repeated practice. These are not actions that can be explained by individual initiative alone. This raises a quiet but profound question. How did groups of hunter-gatherers, without permanent settlements or agricultural surplus, organize themselves to undertake such work? One possible interpretation is that the social capacities required for large-scale cooperation were already present, long before they were expressed through cities or states. In this view, complexity did not suddenly emerge with farming. It was already part of human social life, waiting for different conditions to reveal it. The contradiction deepens when we consider time. Göbekli Tepe was not built in a single generation. The site shows multiple phases of construction, use, and intentional burial. This suggests continuity across centuries. Knowledge of how to carve, place, and symbolically decorate the pillars had to be transmitted. Memory mattered. Tradition mattered. Whatever drew people to this hill did so repeatedly over long stretches of time. Some archaeologists suggest that ritual gatherings may have served as the organizing framework. Seasonal meetings, perhaps tied to migration patterns or ecological cycles, could have brought dispersed groups together. During these gatherings, labor could be pooled, skills could be shared, stories and symbols could be reinforced. This interpretation does not claim certainty. It simply acknowledges that ritual, rather than subsistence, may have been the central axis around which early cooperation formed. The imagery carved into the pillars complicates the picture further. The animals depicted are often powerful or dangerous. They are not scenes of everyday life. They do not show hunting in a literal sense, nor do they depict landscapes or dwellings. Instead, they seem to exist in a symbolic register, one that may have carried shared meaning for those who gathered there. What that meaning was remains unclear, but the consistency of the imagery suggests that it was understood by many, not just a few. If Göbekli Tepe challenges linear models of progress, it does so quietly. It does not announce a new theory. It simply exists, forcing us to reconsider assumptions that once felt stable. Perhaps agriculture was not the beginning of organized society, but one outcome of it. Perhaps the desire to gather, to mark space, and to engage with shared symbols came first. As we sit with this possibility, the site begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like a threshold. Not a sudden leap, but a gradual reorientation in how humans related to one another, to landscape and to meaning itself. To understand that shift more fully, we need to look beyond contradiction and begin exploring the interpretive possibilities that emerge from it. That sense of a threshold invites us into more uncertain territory. Having acknowledged the contradiction Göbekli Tepe presents, we now arrive at the space where interpretation begins, carefully and deliberately. This is where evidence ends and possibility begins, and where restraint matters as much as curiosity. One of the most discussed aspects of the site is its symbolism. The carved animals are not evenly distributed, nor do they appear randomly chosen. Certain species recur with notable frequency, while others are almost absent. Predators dominate. Creatures that inspire caution or fear seem to have been selected intentionally. Some archaeologists suggest that these animals may have functioned as symbolic markers, perhaps associated with clans, stories, or shared myths. Others propose that they reflect a worldview in which humans saw themselves in constant negotiation with powerful forces in the natural world. These remain interpretations, not conclusions. The abstract symbols carved alongside the animals deepen the mystery. Simple geometric shapes appear on several pillars, often repeated across different enclosures. Their meanings are unknown. They may represent counting systems, territorial markers, or ritual signs, whose significance was obvious to those who used them, but is now lost. Without writing, meaning had to be carried through memory, repetition, and shared experience. In that sense, the carvings may have functioned less as messages and more as anchors for oral tradition. The possible anthropomorphic nature of the T-shaped pillars adds another layer. If the pillars do represent stylized human figures, as some researchers suggest, then the enclosures may not simply be spaces surrounded by symbols. They may be spaces inhabited by symbolic presences. The central pillars, larger and more prominently placed, could represent figures of particular importance. Whether these were ancestors, spirits, or abstract concepts is impossible to determine. What matters is that human form and meaning appear to have been expressed through stone long before written language existed. Ritual becomes a useful, though imperfect, word here. It does not imply elaborate ceremony in the modern sense. Instead, it points to repeated, meaningful action carried out collectively. The construction, use, and eventual burial of the enclosures may themselves have been ritualized processes. The act of filling in the structures, carefully and deliberately, suggests closure rather than abandonment. One possible interpretation is that each enclosure had a lifespan, after which it was respectfully retired, making way for another. This raises the possibility that Göbekli Tepe was not designed to last forever in use, but to exist in cycles, built, used and buried, remembered, then transformed. Such behavior implies a sophisticated relationship with time and memory. It suggests that meaning was not fixed in stone alone, but renewed through action. Importantly, none of this requires centralized authority in the later sense of kings or priests. Leadership could have been situational, emerging through knowledge, experience, or ritual role, rather than permanent hierarchy. Social cohesion may have been maintained through shared participation rather than enforced control. As these interpretive possibilities accumulate, Göbekli Tepe begins to feel less like a solitary puzzle and more like a window into early human social imagination. It hints that long before cities and writing, humans were already shaping meaning together. To understand what this suggests about humanity more broadly, we now turn to the idea of continuity and what this site may reveal about the deep roots of social complexity. That idea of continuity carries us gently forward. Rather than viewing Göbekli Tepe as an isolated exception, many archaeologists now approach it as part of a longer human story, one that stretches deep into the Paleolithic and continues well beyond the Neolithic. Seen this way, the site does not introduce social complexity out of nowhere. It reveals it briefly and clearly at a moment when conditions allowed it to take visible form. Long before Göbekli Tepe, humans were already symbolic beings. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and carefully placed burials appear tens of thousands of years earlier. These earlier expressions suggest that imagination, memory, and shared meaning were not late developments. They were fundamental aspects of human life. What changes at Göbekli Tepe is not the presence of symbolism, but its scale and permanence. As the last ice age was ending, environmental conditions in the Near East were shifting. The climate became warmer and more stable. Wild grains grew more predictably. Herd animals followed more regular patterns. These changes did not immediately produce agriculture, but they did alter how humans related to the land. Seasonal abundance may have allowed larger gatherings, longer stays, and more ambitious projects. In this context, Göbekli Tepe can be understood as a place where social bonds were reinforced. Groups that normally lived apart may have come together periodically, renewing alliances, exchanging knowledge, and reaffirming shared identities. The labor invested in the site would not only have produced stone structures, it would have produced trust, coordination, and a sense of belonging that extended beyond immediate family groups. Some researchers suggest that such gatherings may have played a role in the eventual development of agriculture, not because farming was planned in advance, but because repeated congregation created new pressures and opportunities. Feeding large groups consistently may have encouraged experimentation with cultivation. Over time, what began as ritual gathering could have nudged societies toward more sedentary lifeways. This remains a hypothesis, carefully framed, but it highlights how cultural practices can shape economic change, not merely respond to it. Göbekli Tepe also suggests that early humans were capable of abstract planning over long periods. The site's repeated construction phases imply foresight and patience. People invested effort in projects whose benefits were not immediate or practical in a narrow sense. This challenges older assumptions that survival pressures left little room for symbolic or communal investment. Seen through this lens, early humans appear neither primitive nor simplistic. They appear attentive to meaning, capable of cooperation, and deeply embedded in social memory. Göbekli Tepe does not depict the beginning of humanity's intellectual life. It reveals one of the moments when that life became materially visible. As we approach the later stages of this reflection, the focus begins to shift. Rather than asking what Göbekli Tepe explains, we begin to ask what it invites us to reconsider about ourselves, about continuity, and about the quiet foundations of civilization that often go unnoticed. That reconsideration unfolds slowly, almost gently. Göbekli Tepe does not demand that we abandon everything we thought we knew about early human history. Instead, it encourages a subtle adjustment in emphasis. It asks us to consider that the roots of civilization may lie not only in economics or technology, but in shared meaning and collective intention. For a long time, models of early society placed survival at the center of every explanation. Food, shelter, and reproduction were assumed to dominate human motivation. Symbolism, ritual, and art were often treated as byproducts, emerging only once basic needs were securely met. Göbekli Tepe complicates that hierarchy. The investment of labor and care into a site with no clear domestic function suggests that meaning itself was a motivating force. This does not mean that ritual replaced survival. Rather, it suggests that the two were intertwined. Gathering for shared symbolic activity may have strengthened cooperation, reduced conflict, and created networks of mutual obligation. In environments that were becoming more predictable after the Ice Age, such networks could have offered real advantages. Social cohesion can be as vital to survival as food storage, even if it leaves fewer material traces. One possible interpretation is that places like Göbekli Tepe acted as social anchors, fixed points in a mobile world. Even if people did not live there permanently, the site could have existed in shared memory as a place of return. This kind of anchoring may have helped stabilize relationships across wide territories. It may also have contributed to a growing sense of landscape as something structured and meaningful, not just traversed. The act of building itself deserves attention. Working stone is slow and demanding. It requires patience, coordination, and trust. Each pillar raised would have reinforced shared experience. Each carving would have transmitted knowledge and style. Over time, the process of construction may have mattered as much as the finished form. In this way, architecture becomes a social activity, not merely a physical outcome. The intentional burial of the enclosures returns here as a quiet but powerful gesture. Filling in the structures preserved them, but it also transformed them. They were not erased, they were sealed. This suggests an awareness of the past as something to be contained and respected rather than abandoned. Memory was not left to chance, it was managed through action. As these patterns accumulate, Göbekli Tepe begins to feel less like an origin point and more like a hinge. A moment when long-standing human capacities for symbolism, cooperation, and memory intersected with changing environmental conditions. What followed was not inevitable, but possible. From this hinge, the story does not move sharply forward. It spreads outward, influencing how later societies gathered, built, and remembered. To sit with Göbekli Tepe, then, is not to seek conclusions, but to recognize a deep continuity. And from that recognition, we can begin a quieter reflection on what this ancient place still offers to our understanding today. That quieter reflection opens a different kind of space. Having followed Göbekli Tepe through context, contradiction, and continuity, we now find ourselves facing not answers, but interpretive possibilities that remain deliberately open. This is where the site becomes less an object of explanation and more a mirror, reflecting questions back toward us. One of those questions concerns symbolism itself. Why carve images into stone at all, especially when doing so requires such effort? In mobile societies, symbolism is often carried through speech, gesture, and shared practice. These forms are flexible, able to move with people across landscapes. Stone, by contrast, fixes meaning in place. It resists movement. Choosing stone suggests a desire for durability, or at least for repetition over time. Some archaeologists suggest that the carvings may have functioned as stabilizing references in a world still shaped by uncertainty. As climate shifted and resources fluctuated, fixed symbols could have provided a sense of continuity. They may have marked stories that were meant to be remembered in specific locations, anchoring narratives to landscape rather than to individuals. Another possibility is that the imagery served to structure social interaction. The repeated appearance of certain animals may have acted as visual cues, signaling shared identity or affiliation. This does not require formal clans or rigid social divisions. It could simply reflect commonly understood associations that helped coordinate large gatherings. In the absence of writing, visual consistency becomes a powerful tool for shared understanding. The arrangement of space within the enclosures also invites interpretation. The inward-facing pillars create a sense of enclosure without walls in the modern sense. Attention is drawn toward the center, toward the paired pillars that dominate each structure. This spatial organization suggests gathering, orientation, and perhaps a shared focus. Whether that focus was narrative, ceremonial, or symbolic remains unclear, but the architecture itself seems designed to shape experience. Importantly, none of this requires the assumption of formal religion as we understand it today. The word itself carries modern expectations that may not apply. Instead, it may be more accurate to think in terms of ritualized social practice. Repeated actions carried out together in meaningful places, reinforcing bonds and shared memory. Such practices need not be rigid or hierarchical. They can be adaptive, changing slowly over time. The scale of the site reminds us that these practices were not occasional or marginal. They were central enough to justify sustained effort across generations. This challenges the idea that early human life was dominated solely by immediate concerns. It suggests that time was set aside intentionally for activities whose value was social and symbolic rather than directly practical. There is also the question of knowledge transmission. The consistency of pillar forms and carving styles implies learning and teaching. Skills had to be passed on, techniques refined. This points to structured learning environments, even if informal. Knowledge did not disappear with individuals. It accumulated slowly through practice and repetition. As we consider these possibilities, Göbekli Tepe begins to appear less enigmatic and more familiar in a subtle way. Not because we understand it fully, but because it reflects patterns still present in human societies: the need to gather, the impulse to mark space, the desire to remember together. These interpretations remain tentative, and they must remain so. The site does not allow certainty, but it does allow us to imagine early humans not as passive recipients of environmental change, but as active participants in shaping social worlds. With that perspective in mind, we can now move toward an even broader reflection, one that connects this ancient hilltop to the long arc of human continuity that follows. That long arc of continuity extends quietly beyond Göbekli Tepe, moving outward in time rather than upward in achievement. When we place the site within this broader human story, it begins to function less as an isolated marvel and more as a reference point, one among many moments when humans paused, gathered, and invested meaning into place. After Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried, life in the region did not stop. Communities continued to adapt to changing environments, Over time, agriculture did emerge more clearly. Villages became more permanent. Architecture shifted toward domestic needs. Yet many of the underlying patterns remain recognizable. People continued to gather at shared spaces. Symbolism did not disappear. It transformed. Some archaeologists suggest that what we see later in settled Neolithic villages may carry echoes of earlier practices developed at sites like Göbekli Tepe. Communal buildings, shared courtyards, and ritual spaces appear alongside homes. This coexistence suggests that social and symbolic life did not retreat once farming began. Instead, it remained central, woven into daily existence rather than separated from it. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe may represent an early experiment in large-scale cooperation focused on meaning rather than subsistence. Not a blueprint to be copied, but a demonstration of what was possible when groups aligned around shared purpose. The skills developed there, organizational, symbolic, social, could be redirected as circumstances changed. It is also worth considering that many similar sites may have existed and left fewer traces. Stone preserves well. Wood, earth, and ritual practice do not. The archaeological record is uneven by nature. What survives can distort our sense of rarity. Göbekli Tepe may feel unique, partly because it endured, sealed beneath its own deliberate burial, while other gathering places faded back into the landscape. This perspective encourages humility. Our understanding of early human life is shaped by fragments, by what happened to last. Absence of evidence does not mean absence of practice. It simply marks the limits of what we can see. As we follow this continuity forward, the sharp boundary between before civilization and after civilization begins to soften. Instead of a sudden transformation, we see overlapping phases, mobile and settled, symbolic and practical, ritual and subsistence. These were not opposing forces. They were interdependent. Göbekli Tepe sits at one of these overlaps, not as a conclusion and not as a beginning, but as a moment when long-standing human tendencies became unusually visible. A moment when memory, cooperation, and landscape converged in stone. With that understanding, the site no longer demands explanation as a problem to be solved. It invites reflection as part of an ongoing human process. And it is within that reflective space that we now begin to slow further, turning away from analysis and toward a more contemplative consideration of what this ancient place continues to offer quietly to those who encounter it. That quiet invitation lingers as we move into a more reflective register. By this point, Göbekli Tepe no longer feels like a question demanding resolution. Instead, it becomes a place that encourages us to sit with uncertainty and to notice how often uncertainty has shaped human life without being recorded or resolved. One of the most subtle lessons of the site is how much of human history unfolded without leaving clear explanations behind. For tens of thousands of years, people acted with intention, memory, and care, yet left no written accounts of what those actions meant to them. What remains are traces of behavior, not declarations of belief. Stone pillars stand where voices once spoke, carvings endure where gestures once moved. Silence replaces explanation. This silence does not signal absence, it signals depth. Meaning was once carried in living relationships, in repeated gatherings, in stories told and retold until they no longer needed to be written down. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that much of what binds human groups together has always existed beyond documentation. Memory was social before it was textual. The site also invites reflection on pace. Nothing about Göbekli Tepe suggests urgency. The enclosures were built slowly. They were used repeatedly. They were buried deliberately. This rhythm contrasts sharply with modern assumptions about progress and efficiency. Early humans were not racing toward an outcome we would later call civilization. They were responding to their world as it unfolded, adjusting relationships, meanings and practices over long spans of time. Seen this way, the emergence of agriculture appears less like a sudden revolution and more like a gradual rebalancing. Ritual did not disappear when farming arrived, nor did symbolism give way to practicality. Instead, new forms layered themselves onto older ones. The impulse to gather, to mark space, and to remember together remained intact, even as daily life changed. Göbekli Tepe also reframes how we think about intelligence and creativity in the deep past. The people who shaped this site were not experimenting blindly. They were drawing on long traditions of observation, storytelling, and social coordination. Their knowledge was embodied rather than written, shared rather than centralized. It did not require permanence to be effective. In this light, the site becomes less extraordinary and more representative, not because many identical places existed, but because the capacities it reflects were widespread. The desire to invest meaning into the world is not rare in human history. It is constant. Göbekli Tepe simply allows us to glimpse that desire at an unusually early moment, preserved by circumstance rather than intention. As we continue toward our final reflections, the focus shifts again, away from what this place tells us about the past alone, and toward what it suggests about continuity, about how deeply rooted human practices still echo, quietly, beneath the surface of modern life. That sense of echo becomes stronger the longer we remain with it. When we step back from Göbekli Tepe and consider the vast span of time that follows, it becomes clear that the behaviors visible there did not vanish. They adapted. They reappeared in new forms, shaped by new environments and social arrangements, but grounded in familiar impulses. Across later Neolithic communities, we see repeated emphasis on shared spaces. Courtyards, communal buildings, and gathering areas appear alongside homes. These were not strictly necessary for survival, yet they persisted. They provided places where memory could be renewed and relationships reaffirmed. In this way, the social patterns hinted at Göbekli Tepe continued, even as lifestyles became more settled. The transition to agriculture is often described as a turning point, but it is also a process marked by continuity. Farming introduced new routines, new dependencies, and new risks, yet it did not erase older ways of organizing meaning. Rituals tied to seasons, ancestors, and landscape remained central. What changed was not the need for shared symbolism, but the scale and setting in which it was expressed. Göbekli Tepe sits just before this shift becomes visible in the archaeological record. It occupies a liminal moment, when people were still largely mobile but increasingly drawn to fixed places. In that sense, it reflects a growing intimacy with landscape, a recognition that certain locations held enduring significance, worthy of repeated return and long-term investment. This intimacy may have shaped how humans came to see land itself, not merely as territory to move through, but as something that could hold memory. Places became repositories of shared pasts. Over time, this way of relating to land would become essential for farming societies, where attachment to specific fields and seasons mattered deeply. What remains striking is that none of this required formal institutions as we know them. There is no clear evidence of centralized control at Göbekli Tepe. Cooperation appears to have been negotiated rather than imposed. Authority, if it existed, may have been situational and temporary. This suggests that large-scale coordination does not always arise from hierarchy. It can emerge from shared purpose. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe offers a quiet counterpoint to narratives that equate complexity with domination or control. It hints at alternative pathways, where social cohesion is built through participation rather than enforcement. This does not idealize the past. It simply broadens the range of possibilities we allow into our understanding of human history. As we approach the final phase of this exploration, the analytical frame softens further. The site no longer functions primarily as evidence or argument. It becomes a point of stillness in deep time, a place where we can pause, listen, and consider what it means to be part of a species that has always sought connection, meaning, and remembrance. That point of stillness deepens as we move toward the quiet edge of this story. By now, Göbekli Tepe no longer feels like an archaeological object placed under examination. It feels more like a pause in the long movement of human time, a moment where motion slows enough for something subtle to become visible. What emerges most clearly is not a message carved in stone, but a pattern of behavior. Humans gathering without permanent homes, humans committing effort without immediate return, humans shaping places that outlast individual lives. These are not anomalies. They are recurring features of our species, visible wherever time and preservation allow them to surface. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that meaning has always required space. Not just physical space, but shared space. A location where people can return, recognize familiar forms, and re-enter a story larger than themselves. Before writing, before architecture served domestic needs, before cities organized daily life, humans were already creating these shared anchors. There is something quietly grounding in this realization. It suggests that the foundations of civilization were not laid all at once, nor driven solely by necessity. They were layered gradually, through repeated acts of gathering and remembrance, through choices to invest time and labor in things that could not be eaten, traded, or immediately used. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe takes on renewed significance here. Ending use was not an act of forgetting, it was a transformation. The site was allowed to pass into memory, sealed rather than erased. This implies an awareness that places, like stories, have life cycles. They begin, they serve, and they conclude, making room for what comes next. In this way, Göbekli Tepe does not stand apart from later human practices. It resonates with them. Temples abandoned, monuments repurposed, sacred spaces layered one atop another. The impulse to honor the past while moving forward appears again and again, across cultures and centuries. As listeners, we are separated from this place by immense spans of time, yet the emotional distance feels smaller. The questions it raises are familiar. Why do we gather? Why do we build places that outlast us? Why does shared meaning matter so deeply that we return to it, generation after generation? Göbekli Tepe does not answer these questions. It holds them, quietly, patiently, beneath layers of earth and time. And as we approach the final reflection, it invites us to carry those questions forward, not as problems to solve, but as part of what it means to be human. Those questions remain with us as we arrive at the end of this reflection, not seeking resolution, but allowing space. Göbekli Tepe does not close a chapter in human history. It opens a quiet margin, one where certainty loosens and attention deepens. When we stand imaginatively on that limestone ridge 10,000 years ago, there is no sense of an ending, only continuation. People arrive, they work, they gather, they leave, others return, seasons pass, generations overlap. Meaning is not fixed in a single moment, but renewed through repeated presence. The stone endures, but it is the human rhythm around it that gives it life. Perhaps this is the most important thing Göbekli Tepe offers. Not a new origin story, and not a challenge meant to overturn everything that follows, but a reminder that civilization did not suddenly appear fully formed. It accumulated quietly through habits of cooperation, shared memory, and intentional gathering. Long before writing recorded thought was already shaping space. The site also asks us to reconsider what we mean by progress. If monumental construction can precede agriculture, then perhaps progress is not a straight line from necessity to surplus. Perhaps it is a weaving together of needs and meanings, of survival and imagination. Göbekli Tepe suggests that humans did not wait to feel secure before creating symbols. They created security through shared symbols. There is a quiet humility in accepting how much remains unknown. The carvings do not speak in words we can translate. The builders left no names. Their intentions are not preserved in text, and yet their actions are unmistakably human, purposeful, collective, remembered, even if imperfectly. As the last ice age faded and new ways of life slowly emerged, places like this did not vanish from human experience. They transformed. They became villages, sanctuaries, cities, and gathering spaces of many kinds. The forms changed, but the underlying impulse endured. Göbekli Tepe, then, is not a mystery to be solved so much as a presence to be acknowledged. It stands at a transition point, not pointing forward with certainty, and not pulling us backward with nostalgia. It simply reminds us that before history was written, it was lived carefully, communally, and with meaning. And in that quiet recognition, the site returns to stillness, resting once more beneath the earth, asking nothing more than that we remember how long humanity has been thinking, gathering, and wondering together.